In 2009, I debated a man by the name of Dan Barker. Dan Barker has a DVD of music out that is named Your Friendly Neighborhood Atheist. The idea that's presented by the ever-growing atheistic community is that the belief that there is no God is a harmless belief. It's one belief among many, and you can be a good person with a belief in God, and they can be a good person with no belief in God, and it doesn't hurt society. In fact, they would suggest to you that it helps produce a more moral society than religion does, and they would suggest that atheism is actually better for the morality of humanity than a belief in God. That's false. In fact, it's measurably false. It's palpably false. It's totally and completely 100% anti-factual. And I'm going to prove that to you. If you listened to the reading, you heard God Himself in the inspired psalm say, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." But if you were watching and listening closely, you saw the next line of that statement was, "There is none who does good, no, not one. They are corrupt." You see, the logical implications of believing that there's no God leads to moral corruptness. Now, like I said, the atheistic community wouldn't say so. In fact, they've been trying for years to teach us that that's not the case. In 1886, or approximately, a man decided he was going to found a city on the idea of atheism. He named that town, it was actually more of a town, he named it Liberal, Missouri. And he said, in Liberal, Missouri, we're going to have a social experiment, and this experiment is going to be to show the world that atheism can produce a productive moral society. And so he founded Liberal, Missouri, and he said, nobody can come into Liberal who believes in God. In Liberal, we're going to have no God, we're going to have no devil, we're going to have no heaven, we're going to have no hell. All we're going to have are people who believe that this world and the material in this world is all that there is. We're not going to have any type of religious belief whatsoever. And they founded this city to show that atheism helps people and helps society. Now, I was at Liberal, Missouri, not too long ago. Liberal, Missouri is still around. It's still there, population of 779. George Walzer was the man who founded Liberal, Missouri. There's a Walzer Avenue. There's a Darwin Drive. If you can read that sign right above Darwin, there is Thomas Paine Avenue. Thomas Paine wrote an article criticizing very much the Bible and God's inspiration of the Bible. You see Ingersoll Road there, named after the agnostic Robert Ingersoll. In the late 1880s, a man by the name of Clark Braden, who was, from what I understand, a member of the Lord's Church, he was a debater and a preacher, decided he was going to go into Liberal and he was going to see exactly how things were going. And he did, went into Liberal, stayed there a few days to see exactly how things were going, and then he wrote about his experience there in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. He told how all the hotels had become brothels, how the young people used bad language and cursed just like all of the men and women. Said there was no order, there was nothing morally good in the whole place. In fact, he said all the people that had invested their time and money there would get out if they could, but they couldn't because their property value had plummeted so bad. And he said the place was a ridiculous morass of immorality. Now, of course, the people in Liberal didn't take that sitting down. They decided they were going to sue Clark Braden. Here is an actual photocopy of his article, An Infidel Experiment, from the 1880s. My coworker Eric Lyons called the county seat there in the area and actually got this from the newspaper. The people in Liberal decided they were going to sue Clark Braden for $25,000. And they did, and back in the 1880s, $25,000 was a considerable sum of money. They sued Clark Braden, but Clark Braden never even had to take the stand. In fact, the evidence was so powerful that what he had said was the truth, that the case was dismissed without him ever even having to open his mouth, and the person who sued him had to pay all of the court costs. Why? Because if you take a bunch of people who don't believe that there's a God and you put them all together and they behave like they don't believe that there's a God, you have a place that no person in his or her right mind would want to stay, because it's a place filled with immorality, with backbiting, with hatred, with cheating, with lying, with every abominable thing that you could imagine. And that's why God said in Psalm 14:1, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God, there is none who does good, no, not one. You see, the idea that atheism is harmless is a false idea. If you found a society on the belief that we are nothing more than primordial slime that's evolved over millions of years, if you found a society on the idea that we are not created in God's image and that we are not endowed with certain inalienable rights from our Creator, then you're going to have a society that's going to be a murderous, a horrible, terrible, heinous, despicable, disgusting society. And liberal Missouri was evidence of that. Well, George Walzer was an odd individual. He founded Liberal Missouri there, but and I've been to Liberal there, and it's very odd. It's arranged so that his tomb was right in the center of the graveyard in Liberal, Missouri, and all of the other tombs of the people that died in Liberal are in a circle facing his. But his tomb is empty there in Liberal. He's not buried in Liberal, Missouri. He's buried in Lamar, Missouri, about 45 minutes outside of town. And the reason that he's buried in Lamar, Missouri, is because he came in contact with the teachings of Jesus later, and he realized atheism was ridiculous. And he realized that he didn't want to have any part of a burial place where there were a bunch of atheists buried. He wanted to be buried somewhere else because he came to believe that there was a God, and he didn't want to be associated with Liberal, Missouri anymore. As we look through the fruits of atheism, I want to first ask you this question. What if everybody acted like a Christian? Now, I don't mean what if everybody acted like some Christians act. Because you and I both know that there are people who profess to be Christians that don't act like followers of Jesus, a Christian, a follower of the Christ. But what I mean to say is, what if everybody behaved in a way that exhibited a true spirit of following Christ? What if everybody treated everybody else like they wanted to be treated? What if everybody loved their neighbor as themselves? What if everyone decided that they were going to love as brothers, be tenderhearted, be courteous? What if everyone decided to have the mind of Christ and to look out not only for their own things but also for the interest of others, to let nothing be done through selfish ambition, but in lowliness of mind esteem others better than themselves? Wouldn't that be a productive, wonderful society? Wouldn't that be the kind of place where you wanted to live if everyone was behaving like Jesus Christ did and like He instructed His followers to behave? If people were looking out for the poor, if they were following pure religion and undefiled before God, and the Father of this being to take care of the fatherless and the widows and their affliction, wouldn't that be the kind of place that everyone would recognize as a place that you'd want to live? Oh, sure it would. In fact, the atheists themselves understand that if everybody starts acting like a Christian, good things start happening. Now, they wouldn't say that they need to believe that there's a God or that they need to follow Christ, but they recognize that when people act like Christians, things get done well. This is a statement from a man named Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell, in his article, Ideas That Have Helped Mankind, says this about Christianity. He says, Christianity, as soon as it conquered the state, put an end to the gladiatorial shows. Not because they were cruel, but because they were idolatrous. The result, however, was to diminish the widespread education and cruelty by which the populace of Roman towns were degraded. Christianity also did much to soften the lot of slaves. It established charity on a large scale, inaugurated hospitals. Although the great majority of Christians failed lamentably in Christian charity, the ideal remained alive and in every age inspired some notable saints. In a new form, it passed over modern liberalism and remains the inspiration of much that is most hopeful in our somber world. Now, Bertrand Russell, do you believe that you should be a Christian? No, he absolutely positively does not. In fact, he has a very famous article that he wrote titled, Why I Am Not a Christian. He doesn't believe that you should be a Christian. Okay, Mr. Russell, we understand that you don't believe that a person should be a Christian. You don't believe that Christ was actually the Son of God. You don't even believe that there is a God, really. Let me just ask you this question, unbiasedly, from what you've seen. When Christianity takes over and people start behaving like Christians, what happens? Oh, you put an end to gladiatorial shows, you soften the lot of slaves, you inaugurate charity on a large scale, you start building hospitals, and the Christian ideals remain. What's he say there? Remain the inspiration of much that is most hopeful in our somber world. Do you believe in Christianity? No. When people act like Christians, what happens? Things get better. You can't argue with that. It's a fact. A man by the name of Arthur Brooks wrote a book called Who Really Cares? In that book, he was trying to show that it doesn't matter what you believe, doesn't matter if you go to church, doesn't matter if you have faith or not. Everybody gives about the same. The liberal idea-minded person and the conservative person, the person who believes in God and the person who doesn't, about everybody gives about the same. His conclusion, even though that's what he tried to start out saying, his conclusion was far different. He said there's not a single measurable category in which a secular-minded person gives more to charity or more time than a person of faith. You can't find an instance in which a person who doesn't believe in God behaves more morally, generally speaking, in any measurable sense. If you act like a Christian, it's productive. If you behave like there's no God, well, I'm going to show you what happens. If you behave like there really is no God, what's going to be the face of our society? Let's look at a statement by a man named William Provine. William Provine is a higher-up atheist, and he wrote a statement in his Evolution and the Foundation of Ethics, in which he said, modern science directly implies that there are no inherent moral or ethical laws, no absolute guiding principles for human society. Now I want you to stop right there and ask yourself what he's trying to say. Is he trying to say that some things are wrong and some things are right? No, he's trying to say that really there's no possible way you can draw a line and say this is right and this is wrong all the time. He's saying you might be able to say in some instances this is better for society or this is better for society. But if we were to ask the question, is it wrong to shoot 5-year-olds in the head? He would have to say, well, it just depends on who benefits. If it's more beneficial for society and the 5-year-olds don't feel any pain and we could somehow use that to further the human population, then yes, that would be beneficial. If it would harm society, if it would bring too much emotional stress on the parents, if it would, well then no, that wouldn't be beneficial. There's no way you could say yes or no always. It's just always up for grabs as depends on what the benefit for society is. There are no inherent moral or ethical laws. Now listen to me. Who makes that statement? This is not Kyle Butt, a fringe creationist who is making this statement and pulling it out of the air somewhere. This is William Provine, who is recognized in the atheistic community as a leader of that community, who is coming out and admitting the implication of atheism. You understand the difference there? This guy is admitting, hey, if there's no God, you can't really say anything is right or wrong. Psalm 14:1, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have done abominable things. Why? Because if you don't believe that there's a God, if you believe that you're primordial slime, where in the world are you going to draw a line between what one piece of primordial slime can do to another piece of primordial slime? There's just nothing that you can come down on. There's no foundation for ethics, and Provine recognizes that. Now, that means that if you're going to start looking for justification for immorality, you're going to easily be able to find it in the atheistic idea. What I mean by that is, if you were to ask, is the United States of America a sexually promiscuous culture? Well, that goes almost without saying. I did a video for teens and college kids on this topic. I was doing some research on sexually transmitted diseases. Do you understand that every year 3 million teenagers acquire a sexually transmitted disease? That if you were to go to your local mall and you were to count 5 people who are older than 12 years old, 12 years old or older, 1 out of those 5 has herpes. And that's just one sexually transmitted disease out of about 30 that are very prevalent. Just in the past few years, HPV, a sexually transmitted disease, overtook the common cold as the most common illness in the country. If you were to ask, is sexual promiscuity something that is rampant in the United States of America, the answer is far and away, absolutely, positively yes. If you were to ask, is it right? Well, now you got to stop right there and ask, how are you forming that question? Are you saying, is it right if we're created in God's image? Or are you saying, is it right if a person is an atheistic thinker? Because see, if we're created in God's image, and God says in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4, that marriage is honorable among all and the bed undefiled, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge. If you're looking at it from a perspective of God created you and He designed this particular aspect of your life to be something pure and holy, if it is kept in the confines of His design, then yeah. But do you know that if you go to the atheistic society and you were to ask, is this something, I'm going to flip through to Dr. Lawrence Shaw. Here's what Lawrence Shaw said in 2006 at the meeting of the European Society for Human Reproduction. He said, you know, we got about 1 million girls in the United States of America. They're getting pregnant every year out of wedlock. He said, before we condemn our teenagers for having sex behind the bike sheds and becoming pregnant, we should remember that this is a natural response by these girls to their rising fertility levels. Society may tut-tut about them, but their actions are part of an evolutionary process that goes back nearly 2 million years. He said, look, humans are just animals. You might get angry. You might say there's something morally wrong with your teenage girl coming home and saying she's pregnant and she's not married. But really, there's nothing moral or immoral about that. They just happen to be following their evolutionary impulse. Is that right? No, that's not right. That's horribly wrong. But do you know that if you're an atheist and you don't believe that there's a God and you don't believe humans are made in the image of God, then humans are nothing than glorified animals. And they can behave just like animals because there's no inherent absolute laws. And that's why God said in Psalm 14, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. And then followed it up with, they are corrupt. They have done abominable things. There is none who does good, no, not one. Because if you don't believe that there's a God, you've got no foundation for saying this is right or this is wrong. Let me hammer this point a little bit further. I don't even like to mention the word that's on the screen. I think that it's something that is horrible and detestable, and I think you certainly would too. The idea of rape, as you think about that, how in the world would that ever be viewed by a person as right? If you were to go to the Bible and say, could you ever come away with thinking that this might be acceptable? Absolutely, positively not. You could just take the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them to do to you, and you could realize that this type of crime against humanity would be detestable in God's sight and would never find justification in the New Testament or the Old Testament. But do you know that if you were to go to the atheistic thinking on this idea, you would have to see that Randy Thornhill, in a 2001 book, A Natural History of Rape, said in March 16th, 2001 lecture, rape is an evolutionary, biological, and natural process. Our male ancestors became ancestors in part because they conditionally used rape. He says rape is a sexual act that has its origins in what could be called the Darwinist imperative, the desire to reproduce and pass on one's genes. Now listen to me. I hate to even discuss this. I think it's disgusting, I think it's vile, and I think it's not something that we should have to be considering, but it happens to be something that we are having to be considering, and here's why. Atheism is not a friendly neighborhood idea that just happens to be another idea among the many, and if a person adopts it, it doesn't matter. They can be just as moral as a person who believes in God. That's wrong and it's false. Atheism, if a person really believes it and believes that there's no God, is a philosophy that leads to moral corruption. These guys would love to say, and be honest, they would love to say, absolutely, positively not, no, you could never consider this idea to fit with atheism, to fit with evolution, but they can't say it. The reason they can't say it is because if you don't believe that there's a God and you believe that you're primordial slime and I'm primordial slime, then what one piece of slime does to another piece of slime doesn't matter. And that's exactly what God was saying in Psalm 14:1. Let's look at this idea. Charles Darwin said there is no fundamental difference between man and the higher mammals in their mental faculties. You understand that? He's saying, look, you're a mammal. That's all you are. Yeah, there are some monkeys that are very bright. You're a little bit brighter than them. It's not that you have a different kind of intelligence. You just happen to be a little smarter than them. You know what that means? Suppose that you take someone in here, sit him down or sit her down, and you take an IQ test. That person takes one. The person next to you takes an IQ test. Your IQ happens to be a little bit higher than the person sitting next to you. That's what Charles Darwin is saying. Your IQ might be higher than the monkey's, but it's not fundamentally different. You just happen to be a little smarter than a monkey. There's no inherent value that accrues to you because you're a human. You just are a little bit smarter than the monkey. That if you were to sit a monkey beside you in the pew there and you took an IQ test and the monkey took the IQ test and you beat the monkey out, well, just like beating the person out next to you. There's nothing inherently valuable about you. Let me show you what that means. You know what abortion is. It's the murder of unborn children. You know, in 9/11, I remember being at the office and someone saying something was going on, and so we flipped on the TV there, and we watched those planes fly into the Twin Towers. We watched that smoke billow up. We realized that something terrible was happening. That day, terrorists killed about 2,450 United States citizens in the most murderous act of terrorism that our country has ever seen. Our nation was appalled. Our president got on international television and said we were not going to allow this to happen. We were going to hunt down the perpetrators, and any country that was harboring people who would do such a thing, they were going to pay the price, and we were going to bring justice to them if they were harboring people like this. You know the irony of that? That very same day, guess how many of our own citizens we brutally murdered and called it abortion? 2,450 of them. The day before, guess how many we murdered? 2,450 of them. The day before that, guess how many we murdered? 2,450. Do you know we've been killing the equivalent of 9/11 of our children every single day since 1973 to the tune of almost 50 million children? Now, where in the world would you get the idea that it would be all right to take a pair of little more than pliers and to rip a baby literally apart? It's totally alive. The baby is totally living. It's a human baby, and yet somehow, out of convenience, we've decided in our country that it's right, and it's good, and it's wholesome, and it's okay to kill children that are not born. Where would you get that idea? You ever going to get that from the Bible? You couldn't ever get that from the Bible. You go to Proverbs 6, and you read that there are 6 things the Lord hates. Yes, 7 are an abomination to Him, and one of the things that God hates is the hand that sheds innocent blood. You cannot justify murdering unborn children from anything that you would ever get from the Bible. Where can you justify it from? Where can you go to say it would be all right to kill your unborn children? Go to atheism. Now understand, I'm not making this up. I'm not saying just go to atheism and I'm giving you a statement. This is what the atheists themselves say. Read it with me. Among some animal species, infant killing appears to be a natural practice, Barbara Burke says. Could it be natural for humans too? A trait inherited from our primate ancestors? Charles Darwin noted in The Descent of Man that infanticide has been, quote, probably the most important of all checks on population growth throughout most of human history. Okay, now listen to the thought process here. Animals are no different than you, fundamentally. Charles Darwin said. Animals kill their babies. You're an animal, you have a baby that you can't sustain, you don't have the resources for, what can you do with that? Well, according to Barbara Burke, according to Charles Darwin, according to the atheistic idea, there's no inherent moral values. If it's going to help your society. You know, my dad and brother bought a dog that had a pedigree as long as your arm. She was a coon dog. wonderful coon hound. She could find a raccoon anywhere, and she never came in until she did find one. It was kind of troublesome because sometimes she'd run 3 or 4 miles, and you'd have to chase her all over. They thought we're going to have a litter of puppies. Each one of them was going to be worth about $500 to $1,000 a piece. Boy, they were excited about that. So she had the first litter of puppies, had 12 puppies, and they thought, wow, this is great. She just had 12 puppies, $500 to $1,000 a piece. This is amazing. She killed them all but one because she just didn't think she could raise any more than one. The next litter, she had 8. She killed all those but one. Recently, we got some rabbits from some of our neighbors. They said, oh, yeah, these are 2 boys. Look, if somebody gives you rabbits and says they're 2 boys, that probably is not true. I got a call from one of my kids. They said there's a mouse with no hair and no head in our rabbit cage. And I said, no, it's not going to be a mouse. Well, when I got home, sure enough, those rabbits that were supposedly 2 boys had several baby rabbits. They killed them, every one of them. If you're an animal, and animals kill their babies, and there are no inherent moral absolutes for humans, then what does Barbara Burke say you can do if you want to check your population? You kill them too. And who would ever say that's wrong? Well, everybody at some point says, well, there's something wrong with that. But if you're believing in atheism, you can't tell what it is. You know that there's got to be something wrong with that, but when you say, what is it? You can't put your finger on it. Why? Because, listen to me, in the Declaration of Independence, our forefathers said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that men who are created in the image of God have certain inalienable rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by, now listen to it, are endowed by their what? Their Creator with certain unalienable rights. If there's no Creator, who endows those rights? They don't come from anywhere. You don't have them. They're not there. But see, we all know that you're supposed to have those rights. That a human child is supposed to have the rights of a human, regardless of how smart that child is, regardless of how physically able that child is. You see, according to atheism, that's just not the case. Friedrich Nietzsche said, we believe that severity, violence, slavery, danger in the street and in the heart, secrecy, stoicism, tempter's art, and devilry of every kind, that every wicked, terrible, tyrannical, predatory, and serpentine thing in man serves as well for the elevation of the human species as its opposite. I was down in Montgomery. There were a couple guys who wanted another guy's truck. This guy's wife had phoned him, asked him to pick up some milk on the way home. He stopped at a Walmart to pick up milk. 2 guys were waiting for him in the parking lot right outside of his truck. When he got there, they shot him dead and stole his truck. Friedrich Nietzsche, according to his atheism, says, look, we might not like that. We might think that's a terrible idea, but you know what? That eliminated that guy from the population, and apparently those other 2 guys were smarter and stronger than him. So that right there, that action is just as valuable for the elevation of human society as the opposite. Is that despicable? Sure, it's despicable. Is it wrong? Absolutely it's wrong. But when the Bible says the fool has said in his heart there is no God, they are corrupt. They have done abominable things. There is none who does good. No, not one. That's what the Bible is telling you. Now, I'm going to skip Hitler. We're running out of time here. I want to go to the last point here. Several decades ago, there was a man by the name of William Ernest Henley. He was a humanist. He didn't think that there was a God. One of the reasons he didn't think that there was a God because he had suffered so much pain in his life. He had tuberculosis when he was 16. He had one of his legs amputated in a freak accident. Later, I think he was about 40. Some type of chain wrapped around his other leg, and a train drug him down the train tracks. He was injured there, and I think he died in his 50s. He didn't think that God would allow such pain to come into his life, and so he wrote a poem. That poem was the final word that was written by a man named Timothy McVeigh. Timothy McVeigh, the perpetrator of the second most murderous terrorist act in our country's history, the first most murderous terrorist act that was committed by one of our own citizens on our own soil. In Oklahoma, he took that rented truck, drove it into the Oklahoma government building, ignited that explosion that killed about 165 people. 13 of those were kids in a daycare. They asked him what he thought about killing 13 kids in a daycare. He said, it's just collateral damage for the kind of message I'm trying to send. They sentenced him to death, and his last statement was a quotation written down of the poem Invictus. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced or cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody but unbound. Beyond this place of wrath and tears lies but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishment the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Maybe you've heard, especially that last line, I'm the master of my fate. I'm the captain of my soul. You see what Henley and McVeigh were trying to do? They were trying to say that in the face of death, they were unafraid. They couldn't get that idea across, however. Beyond this place of wrath and tears, they said, lies but the horror of the shade. You see, the most bitter fruit of atheism is that God has put so much evidence here for you to come to the conclusion that there is a God. When you deny that evidence, there's only one emotion that you can feel when you're facing death. You can try to put a good face on it. You can try to act like you're brave, try to act like you're scared, not scared rather, but the only emotion that you can feel when you are facing eternity is horror. You got to be scared because you have been presented with so much evidence. You know that there's a God, and you know you've been denying that evidence. A lady by the name of Dorothea Day was enamored with William Ernest Henley's humanistic ideas. She started following him, reading his poems, keeping up with him, and then she came in contact with the teachings of Jesus Christ. And she wrote a response to Henley, and it's called My Captain. Let's read it. Out of the light that dazzles me, bright as the sun from pole to pole, I thank the God I know to be, for Christ, the conqueror of my soul. Since His the sway of circumstance, I would not wince nor cry aloud under the rule which men call chance. My head with joy is humbly bound. Beyond this place of sin and tears, that life with Him and His the aid, and despite the menace of the years, keeps and shall keep me unafraid. I have no fear, though strait the gate. He cleared my punishment from the scroll. Christ is the master of my fate. Christ is the captain of my soul. You see, that's one of the most thrilling fruits of Christianity, is that you can know this morning that when you die, you are going to live with Jesus Christ forever. I was in a debate there with Dan Barker. Dan Barker was explaining that he thought atheism was true. He was talking about the idea of doing something very bad in the name of atheism and it being acceptable. He said, Kyle, you would thank me for committing that crime if it saved your life and the rest of the people's lives in this audience. I said, no, I wouldn't. He said, yes, you would, because you would still be alive. And I said, I would never thank you for committing a crime like that, for keeping me alive, because I know that I've got a better place to go after this life. And he said, no, you don't. You don't know that. And I said, yes, I do. I know it for as much of a fact as I know I'm standing here this morning, that Jesus Christ has prepared a place for a prepared people who will follow Him in obedient faith. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it weren't so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you, and if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. My Savior made me a promise. And that promise was founded on the fact that He rose from the dead exactly like He said, and He ascended back to heaven with His followers watching, and He said, I'll be back for anybody who's prepared themselves to go with me. I'm going to heaven. And any person in the world can go who will obediently bow their knee to Jesus Christ, who will become a New Testament Christian by repenting of their sins and being baptized into water for the forgiveness of those sins, having confessed the name of Jesus Christ, believing that He's the Son of God with all your heart. Do you want to know for a fact that you're on your way to heaven? There's nothing more thrilling than not being afraid to die. Do you need to respond to the Lord's invitation? If you do, I hope you will as we stand and as we sing.
Rock of ages, for me, let me hide myself in Thee. Let the water and the blood from Thy riven side which flowed be of sin the double cure. Cleanse me from His guilt and harm, not the